So Jesus is now entered Jerusalem. This is the last week of his passion, of his earthly ministry. He's going to be inspected. This is all very intentional on God's part, though obviously the Pharisees were not per se doing God's will in the sense that God doesn't afflict willingly. But Jesus is being inspected here in the same way that a lamb being brought to be sacrificed on behalf of a worshiper would be inspected to make sure it was without spot or blemish. And so this is very intentional, the week of his passion, the last week of his earthly ministry as he's in Jerusalem. He allowed himself to go through these interrogations of sorts from the Pharisees and the scribes because it was necessary that the lamb be inspected and be found worthy. Again, I don't know about you guys, but probably there are two or three truths that more than any other warm my heart the most. And one of the top three truths of the whole thing that just warms my heart is the reminder in that when a worshiper in the Old Testament came to worship God, they were not inspected, the Lamb was inspected. And it's an important reminder for you and me as we draw near to the Lord that Jesus is the one that bore the inspection, not us, and that we can come to his throne because of that, because he was slain for our fellowship with the Father and our right standing with the Father, that he was inspected. And that's what's going on here. We are not inspected, and therefore we can come boldly before the throne of grace to find grace and mercy. So starting there, Luke chapter 20, verse 1. Now it happened on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, that the chief priests, the scribes, together with the elders, confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority?" But he answered and said to them, "I will also ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men?" And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, what then? Why then did you not believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it was from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Then he began to tell the people this parable, very clearly about the scribes and the Pharisees, and they knew it. Then he began to tell the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, leased it to vine dressers, and went into a far country for a long time. Now at vintage time he sent a servant to the vine dressers, that they might give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the vine dressers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, and they beat him also, and treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent a third, and they wounded him also, and cast him out. These obviously alluding to the prophets in the Old Testament, like Jeremiah, and how Jeremiah was beaten and thrown in that pit for speaking the truth to the people, in Isaiah, apparently having been sawn in two. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Probably they will respect him when they see him." But when the vine dressers saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, what will the owner of that vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, "Certainly not." Odd response, actually, because he certainly would. But they're saying certainly not because they are picking up what Jesus is putting down. They know exactly what he's saying here. They are the vine dressers. He is the Son of God, as he has been proclaimed, and they knew that he was the Son of the Father, and so they're saying certainly not. They're getting exactly what he's saying. Then he looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Whoever falls on that stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder." And the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them. So what is the significance of a cornerstone first? I did stonework. I did artistic stonework for a number of years before I did what I do now. And, used to do flagstone patios and stairways and things of that sort. And after doing it a number of years, this was, I don't know if it was before YouTube and all of those things, but it kind of was before YouTube. I had to learn a lot of it on the job, and I had to learn it the hard way. But one of the most important things I learned is that you have to get the cornerstone right, particularly if you're making a square patio out of flagstone, which is not square. It's very important that you get that cornerstone, or the four cornerstones if there are four corners, right. Particularly, as was often the case, if you're building one of these patios in a place that has some pretty significant elevation changes. For example, when I set the first cornerstone, some of the things I have to take into account, one thing is that I want the cornerstone to actually have a 90-degree angle for it to be a corner if it's a square patio, even though the stone itself, the other parts of it, might not be square. So I want it to be square. But the other thing is that stone very often is not the thickest stone I'm going to place. And so there's already a foundation of sorts laid, whether it had been some sort of tamped marl or aggregate like that, or whether it was actually a concrete foundation. The foundation is already placed, particularly if it was concrete. You were stuck with the elevation of the concrete, and you had to be careful that first cornerstone you place, if it was one of the thinner pieces, that you built it up enough with mortar so that your thicker stones that you had to place later, if you place this thin one too close to the concrete, the thicker ones would obviously stick up above it. You have to take all these things into account. The reason I'm saying this is because the significance of a cornerstone in building has three primary three primary aspects of significance that I found. And the first one is that the cornerstone really establishes the overall location of the building. It's the one you place. You want to, nowadays and even in Egypt, they would survey and they would find that corner and they would mark the corner, and you place the cornerstone, and you would want to make sure that your sides were perfectly square and going the direction you want, or else your wall's going to get some sort of warble in it or something like that, or your patio in my case. So the cornerstone was very often the reference point, though it may, in this day and age, it may not have been placed first. Very often builders do place them first. It becomes the main reference point for the overall location of the building. But secondly, it becomes the reference point for the orientation of the walls and for the elevation of the other stones, as I mentioned. But the significance of this obviously being that Jesus needs to be that in our lives. He needs to be the central reference point, obviously, for the direction of our lives, for the placement of our lives, for the modern meaning of this, but the orientation of our lives. We need to be letting him govern all of the aspects of our lives. Now, in relationship to the chief cornerstone, there are only, as Jesus says here, there are only two options in light of who he is. You can either fall upon him or he will fall upon you. Verse 18, whoever falls on that stone will be broken, and on whomever it falls, it will grind into powder. I'm sure people can argue this, that, or the other about what the implication of these are. Most people agree that falling upon him and being broken is good, and that being fallen upon by him is not good. Though there are some people that try and make it say, oh, well, he's falling upon you and breaking you so that he can work in your life. Maybe it seems, though, that being ground into powder is a supremely negative thing. For our purposes tonight, we're going to primarily focus on the word broken, and we're going to focus on the virtue of brokenness. It's not something that I hear a lot said about nowadays in Christianity, though when I was much younger, it was something that I feel like was spoken about more often. But tonight, we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about the virtue of brokenness. Now, this word broken here is one of those $40 Greek words that makes you glad that God chose to have the gospel writers and the New Testament writers write in Greek, because this word, it's sunflao, and it means soon. It's spelled S-U-N, but it's pronounced soon. Soon was this word that it was the superlative word for a union. Now, you had words like together or to have in common. Soon, this word was the superlative, the absolute highest version of the word that meant to be in union with someone or something. Soon, flao meant to crush, and so it meant to be in union with crushing. This idea of being broken, falling upon him and being broken. So we're going to look at five things tonight, on brokenness. We're going to look at the reason for brokenness, the necessity of brokenness, the beauty of brokenness, the significance of brokenness, and the power of brokenness. We're going to look at those 5 things tonight, and then we're going to look at a resolution to all those things. So I'm going to reference a couple times tonight a book written by Watchman Nee. Watchman Nee was a Christian brother in the 20th century that spent a very large amount of his life in a Chinese prison for his faith. And he wrote a number of books that are primary one being considered in the top 5 or 10 Christian classics of all time, being The Spiritual Man. My first experience of Watchman Nee, though, was a book that someone handed me while I was in Bible college. We were on a train from Spital in Austria, where our college was, to Vienna, Austria. Someone handed me a book called The Release of the Spirit, and had like a Chinese art on the cover, and I was like, what's this? And I'm like, you got to read this book. And so my first experience of Watchman Nee was actually The Release of the Spirit, and the book was so short that I think I read it on the train ride. Thus began my love of Watchman Nee's writings. But he wrote a book called The Release of the Spirit, and the entire book was about the virtue of brokenness. It was based on the primary passage that he based the book on is a passage we're going to consider shortly when we consider the necessity of brokenness, but it's the primary basis for the book was Jesus's little parable or story about the seed that falls into the ground does not bear fruit unless it first dies. But so I'm going to reference his book a little bit tonight, but it's just a great book. I strongly recommend it. It's called The Release of the Spirit. He says this on the importance of brokenness. Anyone who serves God will discover sooner or later that the great hindrance to his work is not others but himself. He will discover that his outward man and his inward man are not in harmony. For both are tending towards opposite directions. The outward man being your flesh, your soul life, your self life. The inward man being your spiritual life that has been renewed by the Holy Spirit. He will discover that his outward man and his inward man are not in harmony, for both are tending towards opposite directions. He will also sense the inability of his outward man to submit to the Spirit's control, thus rendering him incapable of obeying God's highest commands. He will quickly detect that the greatest difficulty lies in his outward man, for it hinders him from using his spirit. Many of God's servants are not able to do even the most elementary of works. Ordinarily, they should be enabled by the exercise of their spirit to know God's word, to discern the spiritual condition of another, and to send forth God's messages under anointing, and to receive God's revelations. Yet due to the distractions of the outward man, their spirit does not seem to function properly. It is basically because their outward man has never been dealt with. For this reason, revival, zeal, pleading, and activity are but a waste of time, and we shall see there is just one basic dealing which can enable man to be useful before God: brokenness. So I want to consider tonight the virtue of brokenness. So firstly, the reason for brokenness. The reason for brokenness. I'd imagine that everybody in here is aware of the story of Gideon that takes up Judges 6, 7, and 8, so I'm not going to go back and read the whole story of Gideon, except to reiterate some of the high points. You guys know he was threshing wheat in a wine press, which is a terrible place to thresh it, but it was a place where he could do it hidden. And the angel of the Lord reveals himself to him, and says, hey, you mighty man of valor, and calls him into action to deliver the children of Israel from the Midianites. And so he blows the trumpet and 32,000 people show up, and God says to him, hey, the people are too many. Tell anybody who's fearing or anybody who's got crops or whatever, or a wife at home, and they don't want to do this, tell them to go home. And so 22,000 people go home and 10,000 are remaining. They're facing a force of 134,000 people, so it's now the odds are 1 to 13.4 to 1, 13.4 Midianites to every Jew. And God says to him, the people are still too many. And he says, why? In Judges 7:2, he says, the people are still too many because if I give the Midianites into their hands, they will take the glory for themselves. Now, I'm not gonna go into that, basically because last time I spoke in the main church service, I delineated that truth, and it's really important. I highly recommend that you maybe listen to that and consider that truth. If I hadn't taught on it so recently, I would actually do it now, but I don't. We're just not going to do it. But God says the people are still too many, and so he says, if I deliver the Midianites into their hand right now, instead of them acknowledging me and that it was by my hand, they'll take the glory to themselves, and they're going to begin to say, oh man, it was by our might. And the great tragedy of that is that someone in that situation then begins to draw people to themselves and tell people how to fight wars and how skilled they are in warfare, when in fact, it wasn't their skill that brought about the victory. And we as Christians need to be careful that when God brings about victory in our lives, that we don't start patting ourselves on the back and write books about our method and how great we were that this victory was brought about, because it was simply always only an act of God's grace. But so God says, I cannot bring about victory with this many people. Tell the people to go down to the river and get a drink of water. And you guys know the story that only 300 people out of the 10,000 drank in such a way that God said, all right, let's use these 300 people. And so God has Gideon take these 300 guys. And there's some other stuff that goes on. I'm trying to condense the story as much as possible because we have some significant ground to cover tonight. And then they go up, you know the story, it's at night, the Midianites are all camped in this valley, and God takes the 300 men and he has them put these torches in these earthen vessels and go up on the hilltops with these horns, and they go up and they're supposed to break the vessels so that the lights shine forth, and then blow the trumpets and say the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And so they do it. They break the vessels, the light shines forth, they blow the trumpets, they say it. The Midianite camp is confused, they start killing each other, they start fleeing, and the Israelites then swoop in, come out of their caves, and they swoop in and take care of the rest. Here's the deal though, that was very intentionally, obviously you guys see what's going on here, a picture of what God does in our lives when it says there that he uses the idea there of the broken vessels, that the light shone forth through the broken vessels. It's intentionally tied up in the truth of the story of Gideon, that God makes us weak so that his strength can be made perfect in our weakness. And the primary reason behind that is so that he might get the glory, so that we don't begin drawing people to ourselves. And that's why you guys who know me, you know that I'm not an advocate of giving you some sort of impression that I have it all together, or that if you could just be closer to me, your life would be better and your Christianity would work better. I'm not the solution to anything. You guys are like, I know, we know you pretty well. Well, that's actually in some ways kind of intentional. I don't believe in giving you some impression that I have it more together than I do, because that is detrimental to you and you. But I do know the one who does have it together, and I can help you in that progress of faith, drawing closer to him. And I can tell you how he's come through for me when I needed him to, and the way that he came through for Gideon and when Gideon needed him to. But be wary of those. Be wary of Christians, obviously non-Christians, but Christians who they give the impression, usually they are part of a big church or lead a big church or lead a big ministry, and they give the impression or the implication in the things that they say that it's big because their effort, their intellect, their wisdom, their method, their blah, 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 blah. I'm telling you, the longer you read the scriptures, particularly when you read like the book of Judges, you're like, dude, he used Gideon? Guy was kind of a coward, and he was kind of doubting. God had to give him like 3 or 4 confirmations. Do you guys remember that between the point where the 300, God pointed out the 300, and the point they actually went on the hilltop, there was another confirmation? Gideon was apparently still fearing, and so God took him down to the camp of Midian one night, and he went down to a tent, and he overheard 2 Midianites talking about a dream that one of them had, and they declare, oh, that's Gideon and the sword of the Lord, with Gideon coming to destroy us. And the guy, you look at Samson and his hair-raising story, and you're like, dude, God used this guy? It's incredible the people that God uses. But we know from the New Testament very clearly that he intentionally uses the weak, the foolish, the debased things of the world to confound the wise. And somehow, I tell you the truth, somehow in Christianity in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, we've lost sight of that. I don't see much of that anymore in Christianity. I see a lot of very prominent people in Christianity writing books about their method and about their calling and about the thing that they're doing. Even people that I used to highly respect, and I don't want to name drop, but there are people that it's just like, dude, where did you ever get the impression that it was you? It's always grace. God uses foolish, flawed people, and though some aspects of the method are important, it's important to have a prayer life. It's important to have a significant prayer life. It's of utmost importance to stay faithful to the word, but we have to keep in mind that it is God's sovereign work in the life of a believer, and very often his most powerful works happen in the most unexpected places through the most unexpected people. But the reason that God uses brokenness is that it brings him the most glory when he uses a broken vessel. The light shines forth, and the light can only shine forth through a broken vessel. And that's where we start moving into our second point, the necessity of brokenness. The necessity of brokenness. In John 12:24 it says this: "Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." Now, it's important that you understand that the biblical definition of death is two-part. We understand that it's cessation, but it's also separation, right? We know that the biblical definition of death, that there's one aspect of it that ties into the scientific definition of death, and that is the cessation of biological life. That people die when their heart stops beating and their, I guess you medical people could give but the aspiration or respiration stops, all the rest of the brainwaves stop. There's that cessation of life. But there is also the other aspect of death that the Bible talks about, that is spiritual death, and spiritual death is separation. So death has two meanings biblically. There is separation and there is cessation. We know this in Genesis 2 when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit that they were not supposed to eat of. They did not biologically die that day, but they did die. They did die, and you have to understand that. God told them that the day in which they ate of the tree, they would surely die, and they did spiritually die that day. How? They were spiritually separated from God on that day. And so there are the two biblical definitions of death. One is separation and one is cessation. Here, you have to understand, when Jesus is talking about the seed dying, he's not talking about cessation. He's talking about separation. He's talking about the husk of the seed breaking and separating. And this verse becomes the basis of Watchman Nee's his book, The Release of the Spirit. But we're looking here at the necessity of brokenness. The Lord tells us in John 12:24, "Except the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it abides alone. But if it die, it bears much fruit." Life is in the grain of wheat, but there is a shell, a very hard shell on the outside, and as long as that shell is not split open, the wheat cannot grow. Except the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies. What is this death? It is the cracking open of the shell through the working together of temperature, humidity, etc., in the soil. Once the shell is split open, the wheat begins to grow. So the question here is not whether there is life within, but whether the outside shell is cracked open. The scripture continues by saying, "He that loves his life shall lose it, and he that hates his life in this world shall keep it to life eternal." The Lord shows us here that the outer shell is our own life, our soul life, while the life within is the eternal life which he has given us. To allow the inner life to come forth, it is imperative that the outward life be lost. Should the outward remain unbroken, the inward would never be able to come forth. It is necessary in this writing that we direct ourselves to that group of people who have the Lord's life. Among those who possess the life of the Lord can be found two distinct conditions. One includes those in whom life is confined, restricted, imprisoned, and unable to come forth. The other includes those in whom the Lord has forged a way, and life is thus released from them. And so we see then here, again, the necessity of brokenness. It is absolutely necessary, believer, child of God, that God work brokenness in your life, particularly if you want to be used by him. If you want to be used by him, it is only through the breaking of that stubborn, selfish human will that you and I were born with. I was reading up on, you guys, I'm sure you're aware of the old lingo that's actually apparently still used in horse training. That they refer to horses as being broke in the saddle, and they still use the lingo broke. And it apparently came from the days when, you know, the Rough Riders, the cowboys, when they're on the range, if they had a horse die and they would go catch a wild horse, they would have to break that horse's will very quickly. They'd have to go through a very quick form of training, and it was often harsh and brutal, and so they referred to it as breaking the horse. But they were in essentially breaking the horse's will, or that horse's self-will. And the article went on to say that, you know, obviously we don't do that anymore. It's not only we don't do it anymore, you don't need to do it. If you have the time to break a horse properly, you can do it without breaking the horse's spirit, without harming the horse. Interesting read. But you guys, if you're following me, you understand the principle is the same, though, that the reason God, a very large part of the reason that God goes through the breaking process with us, so much so that Jesus said, when you come to me in relationship to me, you are either going to fall upon me and be broken, soon thleo, or you are going to be, or I'm going to fall upon you and crush you into powder. There are only those two options. And Christians, sometimes we do a disservice, I think, because we tend to focus only on the blessings of the Christian life and the good things God has in store for you. And he does have blessings. We are blessed and broken. But I don't see a lot of preaching that nowadays that coincides with the real truth and requirements of the gospel, that if you're going to come to Jesus, you are wasting your time unless you are willing to give everything to him and allow him to break you. To break your will, to break your selfishness. There are a lot of people that come to Jesus because they kind of want something from him. Maybe they're interested in him. Maybe like, oh, I've heard about these cool things that he does. And they come to him. By the way, actually, the context of John 12 is that's why Jesus said this. I'm going to back up to verse 20. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. This is actually the premise for the book, We Would See Jesus. In the King James, it says, We would see Jesus. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn, Philip told Jesus. But Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. What in the world is Jesus saying? I don't know about you guys, but for a long time I used to, in Bible college, first sermon I ever preached in Bible college was on this passage, actually. And man, it was probably really confusing because they just gave us a passage and they're like, preach it to your group. And it was like a group of 10 people. And I'm like, oh, I have no idea what this passage is saying. And it was actually many years later until I'm like, because what Jesus says seems to be completely out of touch with what's going on, until you understand the way spiritual life actually works. These Greeks were coming to Jesus because some form of interest in him, like some sort of intellectual arousal, like, I've heard about this guy, I'd like to look into this some more. And Jesus doesn't go talk to him. Understand that. It's very, very clear that Jesus just says to Philip and Andrew and says, unless wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it falls in the ground and the husk falls apart, then the life comes out, and they're probably like, do we go say that to these guys that want to meet you? Like, what? I'd imagine they were pretty dumbfounded. Understand this, guys. Unless you are coming to Jesus willing to be broken, willing for your life to be broken and unraveled, your old sin nature, the sin nature you were born with that is horribly bent on self-love and self-promotion and selfishness of any form, it has to be destroyed. God hates selfishness. Unless you're willing to do that, and unless you come to God in need, he's not going to hear you. You see, these people weren't coming to Jesus in need. People who came to Jesus in real need always found an ear with Jesus. They always found a hand. They always found a touch from Jesus. He always ministered to the people that came to him in need, but he pretty much never related in any way to the people who were just interested in seeing him for some sort of, I don't know, I want to see what's going on here. The only person he was silent to, the night of the day of his betrayal, was Herod. He actually did speak to the chief priests. He actually spoke to Pilate. He said nothing to Herod because Herod was a buffoon. And Herod was just like, I want to see this guy do a miracle. God is not our puppet. The world revolves around him. It does not revolve around us. And the people who come to Jesus, like these Greeks, and their world revolves around them, and Jesus is just a part of the world that they live in, and they're interested in maybe seeing something from him as part of their own fulfillment, he doesn't respond to that. If you're going to come to him, you are going to come to him. You must come to him with the understanding that just about everything about you is wrong and broken and needs to be broken and changed and conformed into his image. The necessity of brokenness. Guys and girls, people are born completely in bondage to sin. And people are like, well, that's not fair. That I didn't choose to sin. It's not fair that I was born a sinner. Well, okay, that's true. But as my favorite Bible teacher likes to say, he says, yeah, that's true. That's not fair. But it's also not fair that you were also born already forgiven. It's also not fair that your forgiveness came at the sacrifice and pain and turmoil of the Son of God. That's not fair either. And there is a balance in the unfairness that, yeah, you were born a sinner. That's a tough rap. You can sit there your whole life and be like, that's not fair of God that he made, this is the way this reality that we live in worked out. You can live your whole life and take that attitude, or you can take the wisest attitude and say, yeah, this is a bum rap, but it's a really sweet deal that he paid the price for this to be fixed already. Thirdly, I'd like to look at the beauty of brokenness. Mark 14:3 tells the account of when Mary brought the alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and she broke it in order to pour all of it on Jesus as an act of worship. And there is something truly beautiful in brokenness. Not in brokenness alone, but in a heart responding correctly to brokenness. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But I was reminded as I was thinking about this, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge. It's a true story. It's based on Desmond Doss, who was a conscientious objector, and he went into the military to be a medic, and he didn't want to carry a gun. And though I don't necessarily agree with that totally, God honored his commitment to him and his convictions on that, and he went in. And you guys know that when he was in training with his unit, that they roughed him up big time. Like, his unit beat him to a pulp and were really hard on him. And then when they went out and they were at the actual Hacksaw Ridge, that one night, the very men who beat him in his barracks to within an inch of his life were the men that he was dragging over the battlefield that night. Even though he had his own, all of these injuries that they had given him. And you see this beauty in the brokenness, not in brokenness in and of itself. Brokenness is really basically an ugly thing. But when brokenness is responded to appropriately, there's an incredible beauty in it. It reminds me of that passage in the Screw Tape Letters. You know, it's a story. The premise of the book is that an older demon is teaching a younger demon how to destroy a Christian in particular. And at the end of one of the chapters, this is probably my favorite quote from the book. He says, "Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys." Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do God's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. There is something incredibly beautiful about a life that transcends brokenness, about the beauty rising out of something absolutely shattered. There may not be anything actually more beautiful than that, and there is a true and genuine beauty. Just like when Mary broke that flask, the beauty of the fragrance was released when the flask was broken. And the truth is that the beauty of God's life will be released from your life in the brokenness. In the brokenness. There's incredible beauty there. There's probably one of the most beautiful things you can see in the world is compassion. But you can't have compassion without hurt. You can't have compassion without damage, without someone being hurt. It's incredible when you see an act of compassion, when you see somebody from a first world country who has an incredible life, putting their life on the line to go to maybe a war-torn country, as Christians do day in and day out, month in and month out, leave their comfortable existence to go in the way that their Savior did, to leave their comfortable existence to go put their life on the line in the dirt and the mire to help people. Compassion, though, only exists if brokenness exists, and the beauty of that. And so there is a beauty that comes forth there. Fourthly, there is the significance of brokenness. There is the significance of brokenness. If you would, please turn with me to 2 Corinthians 11. We're going to spend the rest of our time tonight in 2 Corinthians 11 and 12, but we'll start in 11. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 22, the significance of brokenness. Brokenness makes us weighty. I want to read you one other verse that just came to mind, actually, from 2 Corinthians as we start this. 2 Corinthians 4:16 says this, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. For we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. For our light affliction, this brokenness that God is working in us, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." And I propose to you that that weight of glory is not just for eternal. It is an eternal weight of glory, but it is something that rests upon the life that is broken and responds to the brokenness appropriately. That life, that person who we're going to look at how to respond momentarily, but that life that responds correctly to the brokenness, a weightiness resides upon that life and upon the things that they say. I think about John Corson. Those of you may not know, I'm going to just give you a quick little blurb about this so that you understand. When he was much younger, he was driving one day to go skiing with his wife, and they hit a patch of ice and their car spun around and his wife died. Roughly 13 years later, one of his daughters, his 16-year-old daughter, hit a patch of ice and spun around and hit a redwood tree just like he did with his wife, and she died. Now his oldest son, who is young, is dying of stage 4 colon cancer. And I look at this man and I've listened to him. He's my favorite Bible teacher, not because of his story. He's my favorite Bible teacher because there's no one I've ever listened to that when they speak, there's such a weightiness to the things that they say. And I can't define that for you because it's not in how he says the things he says. Those of you who heard him speak know that he actually is maybe not the best speaker in the world. He makes up words all the time, and he's not incredibly intellectual or any of those things. He's not uneducated, but he's not hyper intellectual or anything like that. But there is a weightiness to the things that he says, a weightiness, a glory upon his life. And maybe more than any other preacher of this generation that I've heard, when he speaks, I hear the voice of God more than any other person that I've ever heard. And he has been through incredible crushings in his life. I think about after his first wife died, when he came home, he got married again a number of years later. I think 4 to 6 years later, he got married again. And his wife, that he got married to, his second wife, apparently was so beautiful that when he came home from his honeymoon with his second wife, there was a police officer waiting on the doorstep of their house. And they get out of their car and they're walking up to their house after their honeymoon. He says, "Mr. Corson, I have to ask you to leave town." He's like, "What?" He's like, "Well, such and such a hermit they live in Oregon, who lives up in the mountains, has been telling people that he's going to kill you and take your new bride because he has a thing for her." And he's apparently had a thing for her for a long time. And John had to make a choice. He said, "I had to make a choice at that point. I've got young kids and my house and my new bride." And he chose to stay. He said, "Because I trust God. My life is in God's hands. Our lives are in God's hands." And he has gone through abnormal trials. That's not the only trial of that kind that came into his life. And I listened to this man who responded to the crushing by joining himself to the crushing and embracing it. I'm bleeding into my next points. And I look at it and I hear the weight when the man speaks about sufferings and trials. I see the tears in my friend's eyes as they listen to a man talk about his son's daily pain for 25 years as he fought one of the worst forms of Crohn's disease that they've ever seen, and his son in daily intense pain for 25 years. And when this person talks, more than any other person I've ever heard, and I'm not trying to toot this guy's horn, he's a human just like me, but I want to tell you that there is a weightiness due to glorying in the tribulations and in the sufferings and in the trials. I want to read you something Malcolm Muggeridge said. He was probably the greatest living writer of the last 50 years. He's dead now, but he got saved. He was English, and he got saved very late in his life. He gave his life to Christ. But this is something he wrote near the end of his life. He said, "Contrary to what might be expected, I look back on experiences that at the time seemed especially desolating and painful with particular satisfaction. Indeed, I can say with complete truthfulness that everything I have learned in my 75 years in this world, everything that has truly enhanced and enlightened my existence, has been through affliction and not through happiness, whether pursued or attained. In other words, if it were ever possible to eliminate affliction from our earthly existence by means of some drug or other medical mumbo-jumbo, the result would not be to make life delectable, but to make it too banal or trivial to be endurable. This, of course, is what the cross of Christ signifies, and it is the cross more than anything else that has called me inexorably to Christ." I like what he said there. Brokenness brings weightiness, significance to the life of a believer. Listen to what Paul said. He mentions all these things. You know, his apostleship is being questioned by a group of detractors in the Corinthian church. And the coup de grace, the kill shot of his argument for his apostleship is not all of the normal requirements of apostle that were requirements, like having seen Jesus and those types of requirements. The coup de grace of his argument for his apostleship was not his pedigree. It wasn't the boxes that could be checked in his resume. It was the sufferings that he had endured. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil and sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst and fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things that come upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my weakness. My weakness, as he goes on, or his brokenness. Paul's brokenness gave him incredible weightiness and significance. we all see it when we encounter something like this, and you see a person who overcomes insurmountable odds to do something amazing. And in Paul's life, God gave him the grace to do that. So why does brokenness bring weight to a life, to your point of view? Because this world is broken horribly and beyond repair. Transcendence does not come through soaring above all of the brokenness, but by being broken and persevering through it. And then lastly, the last point before we look at over how to make it through the brokenness, the power of brokenness. 2 Corinthians 12:1, it is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ, he's speaking of himself here, who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a one was caught up to the third heaven. I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise, and heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth, but I refrain, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. God must get the glory. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Let me tell you, believer, Christian, so many people want the power, so many Christians want the power of God evident in their lives, and almost none of them are willing to pay the price. Paul said that the power of the resurrection only comes through being conformed to his death. Only. And there are so many good reasons for it. I think about Joseph and how God spent so many years humbling Joseph before he could give him the glory of being the second most powerful human being in the world. And you look at a man who did not abuse that power, but he was first molded and broken to a point where he would be the man that would not abuse the power. And the truth is that if God has for you to carry the glory one day, he is going to have to break you first. Break all of that selfishness and all of those hidden horrible things in your heart that would manifest themselves if you were ever given a place of power and authority. I'm reminded when I think about that of King David, that King David, it says that he was a man after God's own heart, and we all know of the horrible things that he did. And a lot of people, I for many years struggled to reconcile how God could call a man who he knew would be later guilty of adultery and murder and everything that happened. How could God call him a man after his own heart? It's very, 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 very simple. David was one of the best men that ever lived. And you want to know what's in the heart of humankind? Look at what one of the best men who ever lived did when he was given almost complete freedom and power. See, the truth is that none of us will probably ever know what it's like to be a king in ancient Middle Eastern culture where you could do whatever you wanted to people. You see, so many of us, all of us in America, are limited by laws, by financial restraints. We can't do the things that are deep within us, the horrible things that we don't let out because of the repercussions. But if you want to know what's in the heart of mankind, look at what one of the best men who ever lived did when he was given a form of absolute power and freedom. Even one of the best men who ever lived couldn't keep himself from adultery and murder. That's what's in our hearts. Every single human being who has ever lived has deep within the recesses of their heart horrible, horrible selfishness. Selfishness that would murder a brother over over an argument in a field. That kind of selfishness. God must break that. He hates that. He hates self because he knows what is in self. But let me tell you, as I've already kind of bled into this, that being broken isn't nearly enough. The power, the weightiness, and the beauty don't come from brokenness alone, as I already mentioned, but from responding to the brokenness correctly. How? How do we do that? 5 things quickly, and we're going to move through these quickly, I promise, that we see in this passage in 2 Corinthians 12. Firstly, in verse 7, let it humble you. The brokenness that maybe God has been bringing in your life, or he's about to bring in your life, or he will one day bring into your life, let it humble you. Let it do its work of humbling you in other people's eyes. In order for this to happen, you are going to have to take yourself less seriously. You want to know where you are in your progress of faith in relationship to this? How seriously do you take yourself? Do you get all mad and up in a tizzy if someone makes fun of you? Or someone makes light of something that you said or something that's important to you? Well, you take yourself a little too seriously. If you want to be used by God, if you are going to go down this road of being useful in brokenness, you have to let it humble you in the eyes of other people. Verse 7 says, and lest I should be exalted above measure in their eyes, by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. You know, people argue about what this is. I think it was an eye thing, but I'm not going to argue about that. But needless to say, it was something that was public. It was something that was public and humiliating. And Paul learned to embrace it. He learned to embrace his weakness. He learned to embrace the brokenness in his life and to not take himself too seriously. Stop trying to keep it together. Let the brokenness that God is working in your life humble you, and stop trying to present a version of yourself that is higher, better, has it more together than you actually do. Secondly, let it drive you to the Lord. Let the brokenness drive you to the Lord. Verse 8 says, concerning the thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. This thing that came upon Paul drove him to the Lord. And I will tell you that you can let those hurtful, those broken things that come into your life, those breaking things that come into your life, you can let them drive you away from the Lord if you're not careful. If you start getting bitter and questioning why it's happening to you, or what is God's will in this, don't get mad at the Lord. You're getting mad at the only person that can change your circumstances. And this isn't his end for you. It's just part of the process. Let it drive you to the Lord. Let it teach you that you can't solve your own problems and that you need the Lord to solve your problems. And if you can't solve your own problems, you certainly can't solve other people's problems. Thirdly, embrace it. Part of this is just from the idea of phileo. I can't say that word. Soon, union, being in union with it. Embrace the broken thing that God is doing, the breaking. Embrace it. Stop trying to get rid of it. There's a point, Paul prayed 3 times. I don't think it was 3 simple prayers. I think it was, he probably fasted for a very long time and prayed like maybe a week at a time on 3 different occasions, or a significant, I don't think it was, he just prayed, okay, Lord, please remove this. Lord, please remove. That's not what happened. We know the Apostle Paul better than that. It was 3 seasons of praying probably for this thing to be removed, and then he stopped. When God spoke to him and said, hey, this thing's going to persist in your life, just embrace it. Let it be what it is, and trust me, he did. For me, one of the ways that worked itself out, something I don't talk about very much, you guys know that I left engineering school to go to Bible college. What you may not know is that there was actually an occasion or 2 after Bible college when I lost heart and I actually decided to go back. And God was like, nope, not going to do that. And I had to pray and I had to seek the Lord. And there was a point where he literally said, stop trying to go back so that you can be strong in and of yourself. For me, he likened that to when he maimed Jacob when they were wrestling by the stream Jabbok, and he dislocated his hips so that he could no longer run, and he could no longer run in his own strength. For some of you in here, there might be something like that in your life where you are trying to change it, and it is the very thing that God wants to leave in your life to keep you relying on him. And in your flesh, you are dying to get back into a position where you can be strong and where you don't have to rely on. You wouldn't say it this way. You would say, I don't want to rely on the Lord, but that is actually what's happening. God has put you in a situation and worked out, and maybe you even agreed to it, and you willingly went into the situation, but as the years go on, you go, I don't really like this. I look at people around me and I look at how good their lives are, or at least how good I perceive their lives to be, and yeah, I love God, but this is hard, Lord. I'd really like for things to be easier, and you can long for your situation to change. And some of you might hear the Lord maybe tonight, or maybe you've heard him recently say to you, no, this is the thing I have in your life. I've dislocated your hip. You're always going to walk with a limp, and you're always going to need to rely on me, and you need to trust him in that. He knows what's best for you. He wants to use your life. If he genuinely wants to use your life powerfully, he's going to do something like that in it. Embrace it. Marry it. I think of marriage when I think of the union thing. Fourthly, choose joy. Choose joy, to rejoice. And in verse 9, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I'd rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Most gladly, Paul found the joy in the brokenness. Brokenness in and of itself will not make you powerful or weighty or beautiful, but choosing joy in it will. I think about Jeremy Camp. You guys may not know this. Jeremy Camp's first wife died. She actually went to my Bible college, though I think it was a couple semesters before I was there. In California, she was there. Jeremy Camp and his wife got married, and on his honeymoon, God gave him that song, I Will Walk by Faith. And he was like, God, why are you giving me a song about walking down a broken path on my honeymoon? I mean, my life is so good. It's so high right now. Well, within a few months of his honeymoon, his wife was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she was dead later that year. I won't go into the details of it, except when she died in the hospital room, people who were there said, he just stood up and he worshiped the Lord. He responded by worshiping the Lord. He responded as Job responded when he said, the Lord gives. He tore his clothes. The Lord gives. The Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that is the ultimate response that will embrace what God is doing in your life and take you down the path of usefulness. How? How do you respond that way? Well, partly you see his intent. You see God's intent, and you see there that Paul said in verse 9, that he saw that the brokenness was making him useful, and that the brokenness was taking him somewhere. It wasn't the end of his life. It was part of God's purpose for his ultimate good, and you have to see God's intent in your brokenness. You can lose the forest for the trees. If you're just looking at the situation and the brokenness of that situation, you can lose the big picture that he loves you, and he always has your best interest at heart. Father, I thank you for your word, and I thank you for the truths that we've considered tonight. I ask, Father, that you would sink these deep down into our hearts, the parts of this that were yours, that were true. I pray for everyone here, anyone here who maybe, I don't know of anyone here that's super broken, but maybe someone is more broken than they're putting on. And I pray, Lord, that you would draw near to them and that you would use them. I pray for everyone here that we wouldn't allow there are times of brokenness to just be hurtful things that happen to us, but that we would make them useful, that we would surrender them to you. Father, I love you, and I thank you that you are the God who gives and takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.